Marcus slid the envelope across the polished oak table without smiling. It stopped just inches from my plate, the thick paper whispering against the wood in a way that felt louder than it should have. No one reached for their glass. No one spoke. Even the soft hum of the air conditioner seemed to pause, as if the room itself was waiting to see what I would do. "Just sign it tonight." "Harold," Marcus said, his voice smooth but tight around the edges. "It'll make things easier for everyone." I didn't touch it. Not yet. Rachel sat across from me, twisting the corner of her napkin into a tight knot. She didn't look at me. Not once. Her eyes stayed fixed on the table, on the silverware, on anything that wasn't my face. The envelope was already open. That was the first thing that bothered me. Paperwork handed to you at dinner wasn't unusual in families that shared responsibilities. But paperwork opened before you even saw it. That meant someone expected your signature before your understanding. Marcus leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table as if he were settling in for a negotiation rather than a meal with family. "Everyone signs these eventually," he added. That sentence stayed in the air longer than it should have. Rachel cleared her throat, her voice softer than usual. "It's just temporary support paperwork," she said. "Nothing serious." But her hands trembled when she reached for her water glass. That was when the feeling hit me, quiet but unmistakable. The same sensation I had learned to trust decades earlier, when business deals stopped feeling like agreements and started feeling like traps. This dinner was never about family. It was about leverage. I placed my fingers lightly on the edge of the envelope but didn't open it yet. I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. I wanted to see who would break first. Marcus did. "It's routine," he said quickly. "Company paperwork. Nothing complicated. Routine." That word always made me cautious. Real routine never needed explanation. I finally lifted the envelope, feeling the weight of it settle into my palm. It was heavier than it should have been. Multiple pages. Thick stock paper. Legal formatting by the feel of it alone. I slid the contents out slowly, taking my time, letting the movement drag just enough to make Marcus shift in his chair. The first thing I saw was the logo. North River Freight Solutions. The sight of it sent a quiet ripple through my chest, though my face remained still. Most people at that table would have seen nothing more than a corporate brand printed neatly across the top of the page. But I saw something else. History. Memory. Years of sleepless nights and decisions that had carved lines into my hands long before age did. I didn't react. Not outwardly. Instead, I adjusted my glasses and lowered my gaze back to the document, as if it were nothing more than paperwork handed to any ordinary man. Marcus spoke again, too quickly. "It's just a small financial authorization," he said. "Temporary responsibility coverage. Standard practice." He spoke in broad phrases. Vague language, the kind meant to comfort people who didn't understand what they were signing. Rachel added quietly, "You trust us." "Don't you?" That question landed heavier than the paperwork. Trust. A word that could build companies or destroy families. I continued reading, line by line, slowly, carefully. Halfway down the second page, buried in language designed to discourage curiosity, I found the clause that made my stomach tighten. Personal liability responsibility, not corporate. Personal, if signed. This document wouldn't protect anyone. It would shift risk onto my name, my assets, my history. I lowered the page slightly and looked up at Marcus. He forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Rachel kept staring at the table. That silence between us thickened until it felt like breathing through smoke. Rachel reached for her glass again, but this time I noticed something new. Her signature, already written on her copy of the document resting beside her plate. Neat. Confident. Permanent. She had signed without hesitation. That realization didn't anger me. It hurt me. Because when strangers mislead you, it's strategy. When family does it, it's betrayal. I returned my attention to the document, keeping my voice steady when I finally spoke. I never sign anything without reading it twice. I said calmly. Marcus's jaw tightened, just for a second, before his expression smoothed over again. "We really need this done tonight," he replied. "Timing matters. Need, not want." That word stayed with me. I turned to the final page. At the bottom, beneath the legal paragraphs and approval sections, there was a reference code printed in smaller type. Most people wouldn't have noticed it. Most people wouldn't have recognized what it meant. But I did. Immediately. Project Redline. My fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the paper. Years ago. That code belonged to an expansion initiative I had designed myself, one that was supposed to reshape distribution routes across 3 states. A project that had never been completed. A project tied to documents that had vanished under circumstances no one ever fully explained. Seeing that code again felt like hearing a voice from the past whisper your name in a crowded room. I closed the folder slowly, deliberately. Then I looked at Marcus. Really looked at him. At the expectation in his posture. At the tension in Rachel's shoulders. And in that quiet moment, as the air around us thickened with unspoken pressure, I began to understand something that changed the meaning of that entire evening. They hadn't invited me to dinner for family. They hadn't invited me for conversation. They had invited me because they believed I was useful. And for the first time that night, I realized this wasn't about paperwork. It was about control. I didn't drive away right after leaving Rachel's house. The engine stayed off. My hands rested on the steering wheel, fingers still feeling the faint roughness of the paper I had folded back into the envelope. Outside, the neighborhood sat quiet under the dim wash of streetlights. Every house looking calm, ordinary, safe. But nothing about that night felt ordinary anymore. Marcus's voice replayed in my head, clear and steady, like an echo I couldn't silence. Everyone signs these eventually. Not if they understand what they're signing. I leaned back against the seat and exhaled slowly, letting the silence wrap around me. I had learned long ago that rushing decisions never saved anyone. The best protection had always come from patience, from watching, listening, remembering. Especially remembering. I lifted the envelope again and ran my thumb along the printed logo at the top of the page. North River Freight Solutions. Most people saw a company name when they looked at that logo. A brand. A business. A place where shipments moved in and out like clockwork. But I saw something else entirely. I saw mornings before sunrise. Cold metal under my palms. The sharp smell of diesel hanging in the air like a promise of work still waiting to be done. The memory pulled me backward without warning. Back to a loading dock that barely existed yet. Back to the first day it all began. There had been only one truck back then. One. Old enough to rattle when it idled. Its engine coughing like it didn't trust the future any more than I did. I remembered standing beside it in worn boots. Coffee in one hand, clipboard in the other, watching the sun rise over an empty stretch of gravel that would one day become something bigger than I ever imagined. That first contract had nearly broken me. One missed delivery. One broken axle. One bad week. Any of it could have ended everything before it began. But failure had never been an option. Not when everything I owned had been poured into that single gamble. North River wasn't built overnight. It was built through nights that never seemed to end. Missed holidays. Empty dinner chairs. Phone calls taken at hours when decent people were asleep. And beside me, through those early years, had been Victor Langston. Victor had been younger then. Confident. Quick with numbers. Even quicker with promises. Where I saw obstacles. He saw opportunity. Where I hesitated. He pushed forward. We trusted each other without question. At least in the beginning. I could still hear his voice from those early mornings. Standing beside that first truck as it warmed up in the cold air. "One day this place will be worth more than we can imagine," he had said, grinning like a man who already saw the future laid out in front of him. Back then, I believed him, and for a while, he was right. The company grew faster than either of us expected. Contracts multiplied. Routes expanded. New drivers came in, each one bringing another family tied to the success of what we were building. The gravel lot turned into concrete. The single truck became 10, then 20. Success has a sound to it. Phones ringing nonstop. Engines roaring at dawn. Voices shouting instructions across busy docks. But success also brings something quieter. Pressure. And pressure reveals things you never expected to see. The first sign came as numbers. Small discrepancies. Nothing dramatic at first. Just figures that didn't quite line up the way they should have. A few dollars here. A slight delay in payment there. Mistakes that could be explained away if you wanted them to be. And I did. I wanted to believe it was nothing. Victor dismissed it quickly whenever I asked. Clerical errors, he said once, waving his hand like the problem wasn't worth the air it took to speak about it. I let it go. That decision would follow me for years. Because not long after those first numbers began drifting off course, something far worse happened. A document disappeared. Not misplaced. Not lost. Removed. I remembered the night clearly. I had stayed late in the office, reviewing contracts tied to a major expansion plan, one I had designed myself. It was the largest step North River had ever attempted, connecting multiple distribution hubs across 3 states. Project Redline. Every detail had been carefully mapped out. Routes calculated. Costs analyzed. Risks measured. And at the center of it all had been one authorization file, the legal backbone that allowed the entire operation to move forward. I locked that file in my office cabinet before leaving that night. The next morning, it was gone. Not damaged. Not scattered. Gone. No forced entry. No broken locks. No explanation that made sense. Victor denied any involvement. The board dismissed it as internal confusion. And eventually, the official explanation settled into the easiest version possible. Misfiled. Lost in transition. But I never believed that. Not completely. That was the first moment I understood something dangerous. Trust inside a company isn't guaranteed. It's tested. And sometimes, it breaks. The months that followed forced decisions I never wanted to make. Pressure from investors grew. Questions from board members sharpened. Every move felt watched, measured, weighed against expectations I could no longer fully control. Eventually, stepping away became the safest move. Publicly, I retired. Privately, I protected what I had built. Very few people knew the truth, that I never truly left North River behind. My ownership remained hidden, secured in structures designed to protect the company from internal collapse. Insurance against betrayal. Insurance against ambition. Insurance against exactly the kind of risk now sitting inside the envelope on my lap. A memory surfaced then, sharper than the others. Rachel, standing in the doorway of our house years ago, small hands gripping a sheet of paper covered in crayon drawings. I had arrived late again that night, long after dinner had gone cold. She had waited. That was the part that hurt most. She had waited for hours, holding that picture like it mattered more than anything else in the world. "Do you love the company more than me?" she had asked. Children ask questions adults pretend not to hear. I remembered smiling weakly, brushing her hair aside, promising we'd talk later. We never did. The silence inside my car returned, heavier now than before. I lowered my gaze back to the document in my hands and turned to the final page again, studying the reference code printed in small, precise letters. Project Redline. Still there. Still alive. Still connected to something that had never been properly finished. That wasn't coincidence. That was continuity. Someone had reopened a door I thought had been sealed years ago. And whoever did it knew exactly where to look. I reached for my phone, scrolling slowly through the contact list until I found the name I hadn't called in years. Samuel Reeves. The only man outside my own memory who understood the structures hidden beneath North River's surface. My thumb hovered over his number for a moment before pressing the call button. The phone rang once, twice. Then he answered. No greeting. No hesitation. Just his voice, steady and certain, cutting straight through the silence. "I was wondering when you'd call," he said. A pause followed. Then his next words landed heavier than anything I had heard that night. Because someone else already contacted me about North River. Samuel was already waiting when I stepped into his office the next morning. He didn't stand, didn't smile, didn't offer coffee the way he used to whenever business felt routine. Instead, he sat behind his desk with his glasses low on his nose, fingers resting on a stack of legal pads as if he had been expecting trouble long before I arrived. "Tell me you didn't sign it," he said. No greeting, no pleasantries. Just that one sentence hanging in the air between us. "I didn't," I replied, placing the envelope carefully on his desk. Only then did he exhale, leaning back slightly in his chair, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to notice. "Good," he murmured. "That gives us time." Time. The word sounded fragile in that room, like something that could disappear without warning. Samuel pulled the papers from the envelope and began reading without another word. His office was quiet except for the soft rustle of turning pages and the distant hum of traffic filtering through the tall windows behind him. Shelves lined the walls, heavy with law books that had survived decades of corporate battles and legal wars most people never heard about. I watched his face as he read. Years ago, I learned that lawyers didn't reveal panic in their voices. They revealed it in their silence. Halfway down the second page, he stopped. Not completely, just paused, his eyes fixed on a single line as if it had reached out and grabbed him by the collar. Then he removed his glasses slowly and read the same paragraph again. That repetition told me everything. "This isn't routine paperwork," he finally said. I didn't respond. I already knew that. Samuel placed the document flat against the desk and tapped a section with the tip of his pen. "This," he said quietly, "is a transfer mechanism." The words landed heavier than expected. "Transfer of what?" I asked. "Responsibility," he replied. "Authority. Exposure." He slid the paper toward me, pointing at a block of legal language buried halfway down the page. "Look here," he said. I leaned forward, reading the clause carefully. Temporary financial liability authorization. That part I had already seen, but beneath it, hidden in smaller print, sat a second phrase I hadn't fully processed the night before. Conditional operational authority access. I felt something cold settle into my chest. Samuel watched me read. "If you sign this," he continued, "it doesn't just make you financially responsible. It creates a legal pathway for operational authority to be accessed through your credentials." "My credentials?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "And that's where this becomes dangerous." Dangerous. Not risky. Not inconvenient. Dangerous. Samuel reached for his computer keyboard and typed quickly, pulling up a digital database filled with corporate filings and archived documents. His fingers moved with practiced speed, navigating systems that felt like second nature to him. Then he stopped again. His eyes narrowed slightly at the screen. "Why does this authorization reference Project Redline?" he asked. The room felt smaller suddenly. "Because that was my expansion project," I replied quietly. "Years ago." Samuel turned the monitor toward me. "There it is," he said. The code appeared on the screen, identical to the one printed on Marcus's document. Clean. Precise. Impossible to ignore. Project Redline. A name I hadn't spoken aloud in years. "That project was discontinued," Samuel said carefully. "Officially closed." "It never disappeared," I replied. Samuel leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together as he studied the document again. "There's more," he said. I waited. He flipped to the final page and pointed at the signature section. "This document activates something called a signature cascade," he explained. "If your name is added here, it triggers dormant privileges tied to your original ownership structure." My pulse slowed, not quickened. Years of experience had taught me that fear didn't help. Clarity did. "Privileges no one should know about," I said quietly. Samuel nodded once. "Exactly." Silence stretched across the room. "Who else knows about your controlling shares?" he asked. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I counted backward through memory. Victor Langston, I said finally. You? One former board member. Samuel nodded slowly. That board member died 3 years ago, he added. I felt the weight of that information settle deeper than expected. That left fewer names, fewer possibilities, fewer places for trust to hide. Before either of us spoke again, my phone vibrated against the desk. Rachel. The timing felt too precise to ignore. Samuel glanced at the screen. Then back at me. You should answer that, he said. I picked up the phone and pressed accept. Rachel's voice came through softer than usual, but forced, like someone trying to sound calm while standing too close to danger. Did you finish signing the paperwork? She asked. Not hello. Not how are you? Just that question. I'm still reviewing it, I replied calmly. There was a pause on the line, short, but noticeable. Marcus said it shouldn't take that long, she added. That sentence confirmed something I had suspected. Marcus wasn't waiting passively. He was monitoring progress. I don't rush signatures, I said. You know that. Another silence followed. Then she spoke again, quieter this time. Just let me know when it's done. The call ended. Samuel leaned forward immediately. They're applying pressure, he said. I noticed he turned back to his screen, typing again, searching deeper into archived records. Minutes passed. Then he stopped once more, his expression tightening in a way that felt unmistakably serious. There's something else, he said. What now? I asked. He printed a set of documents and handed them to me. I scanned the pages quickly. Account activity logs, transaction histories, small transfers. Repeated. Systematic. An inactive holding account tied to Marcus's division was reactivated recently, Samuel explained. Not publicly. Quietly. I looked up at him. How bad is it? I asked. Samuel held my gaze steadily. If this pathway continues, he said slowly, your company could collapse financially within months. The words didn't frighten me. They clarified everything. This wasn't about paperwork. This wasn't about Marcus asking for help. This was about control. And someone inside North River had begun moving pieces long before that envelope ever reached my dinner table. Samuel slid one final report across the desk toward me. If Marcus signs anything connected to this pathway, he said quietly, he won't just hurt you. He paused, long enough for the truth to settle in before he finished. He could destroy everything you built. The sunlight outside Samuel's office felt too bright for the kind of news I had just heard. I stepped onto the sidewalk slowly, the weight of the documents still heavy in my hand, my thoughts moving faster than my body. Cars passed in steady lines. People walked with purpose. Life moved forward like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Samuel's last words echoed in my mind. He could destroy everything you built. I reached the curb and paused before crossing, my instincts sharpening in ways they hadn't in years. That quiet alertness, the kind that came from decades of navigating deals where trust could cost millions, had returned without warning. That was when I noticed the car. A dark sedan parked across the street. Engine running. At first glance, nothing unusual. Downtown Austin had no shortage of waiting vehicles, rideshares, and delivery drivers. But this one sat too still. No driver stepping out. No phone held to the ear. No movement inside. Just presence. Watching. Or maybe I was imagining things. But men who survive long enough in business learn one simple truth. Coincidence happens once. Patterns happen twice. I crossed the street without looking back again, refusing to give whoever sat inside that car the satisfaction of knowing they had my attention. Still, I could feel something tightening inside my chest, not fear, but awareness. My phone rang just as I reached the parking garage. Unknown number. Normally, I ignored calls I didn't recognize, but nothing about this morning felt normal. I answered. Before I could speak, a voice came through, older, steady, unmistakably familiar. We need to talk. Today. Victor Langston. The sound of his voice carried weight I hadn't felt in years. Not surprise exactly. Not anger. Something closer to unfinished business finally knocking at the door. Where? I asked. Same place as before, he replied. You remember? Then the line went dead. Of course I remembered. Victor never forgot a location that once mattered. The restaurant sat tucked into a quiet side street not far from downtown. Small. Private. The kind of place built for conversations that weren't meant to be overheard. I hadn't stepped inside it in more than a decade. But walking through its doors again felt like stepping into a memory I had tried to leave behind. Victor was already seated. He didn't stand when I approached. Didn't extend his hand. Just watched me the way he always had. Calculating. Patient. Never wasting motion. Time had aged him, but not weakened him. His hair had turned silver. But his eyes still carried that sharp, searching quality that once made him the most dangerous negotiator I had ever known. You finally saw the document, he said. Not a question. A statement. I sat across from him slowly, placing my briefcase beside the chair. How did you know about it? I asked. Victor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the glass of water in front of him and took a slow sip, as if measuring how much truth I deserved. Because, he said finally, lowering the glass, Marcus isn't smart enough to design something like that. That sentence shifted the air between us. You're saying he didn't write it. I said, I'm saying, Victor replied calmly, someone smarter is standing behind him. That possibility had already begun forming in my mind, but hearing it spoken aloud made it harder to ignore. Victor leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. You remember Project Redline? He said. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The name alone carried enough history to fill the silence between us. Victor reached down beside his chair and lifted a slim leather briefcase onto the table. He opened it slowly, deliberately, the way a man handles something fragile or dangerous. Inside lay a folded document. He slid it across the table toward me. The motion mirrored Marcus's gesture from the night before, but this time, the power felt reversed. I opened the paper carefully. It took only seconds to recognize what I was looking at. An authorization draft. Older formatting. Earlier version. One tied directly to the original Project Redline structure. You kept this, I said quietly. Victor nodded once. I suspected something years ago, he said. Something neither of us could prove at the time. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. His eyes didn't shift away from mine. Because suspicion without proof destroys partnerships faster than betrayal does. The truth of that answer stung more than I expected. Victor tapped the bottom of the document with his finger. Look here, he said. I followed his gesture. Recent markings. Updated approval codes. Marcus Hale's name appeared clearly within the authorization chain. But beneath it, another code. One I didn't recognize. This approval didn't come from Marcus. Victor continued. It came from someone above him. An internal supervisor. I said. Victor nodded again. And whoever that is, he added, understands your ownership structure better than they should. Silence settled over the table again. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Victor leaned back in his chair, studying me carefully. There's more, he said. I waited. Financial transfers, he continued. Small amounts. Repeated over time. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger alarms unless someone knows where to look. Siphoning. I said. Exactly. That word carried weight. Not theft. Not accident. Strategy. Victor watched my reaction closely. You still blame me for what happened back then, he said quietly. The accusation wasn't wrong. Years ago, when the original Project Redline file disappeared, suspicion had hovered around everyone, including him. Trust fractured slowly after that night. Even if it never shattered completely, some things never fully heal, I replied. Victor didn't argue. Instead, he leaned forward again, lowering his voice further. There's going to be an internal audit, he said. My attention sharpened instantly. Who triggered it? I asked. Anonymous request. he answered. But fast-tracked. That doesn't happen without influence. An audit meant exposure. Exposure meant panic. And panic meant mistakes. Victor reached into his briefcase again and removed a sealed envelope. Thicker than the first. Older paper. Different weight. He placed it in front of me carefully. Inside that envelope, he said quietly, is the original draft tied to Project Redline. I stared at it without touching it. Memory pressed against the present like two storms colliding. Victor held my gaze steadily. If the wrong person gets that document first, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, your daughter's husband won't be the only one in danger. He paused. Long enough for the meaning to settle. You will be too. The house felt too quiet when I stepped inside. Not peaceful quiet. Not the kind that settles over a place at the end of a long day. This was the hollow kind. The kind that made every footstep echo just a little louder than it should. I set Victor's sealed envelope on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, staring at it without touching it. The paper looked older than the others I had seen that week. Thicker, somehow, as if it carried history inside its folds. Beside the window sat a framed photograph I hadn't noticed in years. Rachel, no older than 8, standing barefoot in the backyard with a crooked smile and a birthday card clutched proudly in both hands. Glitter glued unevenly across the front. My name written in large, uneven letters. I remembered that day. She had worked on that card for hours, refusing help from anyone, insisting she wanted it perfect. I had promised to come home early that evening. I didn't. That memory lingered longer than I expected. The sound of the doorbell cut sharply through the silence. I frowned. Rachel rarely visited without calling first. That alone was enough to tighten something inside my chest. I walked to the door and opened it. She stood there, already shifting her weight from one foot to the other, purse hanging from her shoulder, fingers gripping the strap too tightly. Hi, Dad, she said. Too fast. Too casual. Rachel, I replied, stepping aside to let her in. She moved past me quickly, scanning the room as if checking for something, or someone, before settling near the dining table. But she didn't sit. She remained standing, restless, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. You came without calling, I said calmly. I was nearby, she replied. That wasn't like her. Not anymore. She glanced toward the kitchen counter, toward the sealed envelope Victor had given me, then quickly looked away as if pretending she hadn't noticed it. Did you finish signing those papers? She asked. There it was again. The same question she had asked over the phone. Not about how I was doing. Not about whether I had eaten. Just the paperwork. I'm still reviewing them, I said. She nodded quickly. Too quickly. That's good, she murmured. Marcus said it shouldn't take long, Marcus said. The phrase felt rehearsed. I watched her carefully now, the way she avoided my eyes. The way her fingers tapped lightly against her purse strap. The way her shoulders stayed tense even though her voice tried to sound relaxed. Something about her movements felt unnatural. That was when I noticed the zipper on her purse. Slightly open. Just enough to reveal the corner of a folded document inside. White paper. Corporate letterhead. North River Freight Solutions. The sight of it pulled my attention instantly. Rachel had no reason to carry company documents in her purse. Not for her work. Not for anything she had ever told me. Rachel, I said quietly. Did Marcus explain what those papers actually do? She froze for a fraction of a second, then forced a smile. They're just formalities, she said. The word landed heavily. Formalities. Marcus had used that same word. Exactly the same way. That repetition told me more than she realized. Her phone buzzed suddenly inside her purse. She pulled it out quickly, glancing down before she could stop herself. For a brief second, I saw the notification reflected in her eyes. Bank alert. Large transaction received. Sender name partially visible. Marcus Hale. She turned the screen away immediately, slipping the phone back into her purse. But I had already seen enough. Money. Movement. Coordination. My chest tightened, not with anger, but with understanding forming piece by piece. Rachel cleared her throat, forcing her voice back into a calm tone. "We're just trying to get everything organized," she said. Organized. Another vague word. Another shield hiding specifics. I leaned back slightly, studying her face. And for a moment another memory surfaced, uninvited but impossible to ignore. Rachel at 6 years old, riding a bicycle down our old driveway, her small hands gripping the handlebars too tightly, her voice rising in panic as the wheels wobbled beneath her. "Don't let go." "Dad," she had shouted. I ran beside her, holding the back of the seat, promising her she wouldn't fall. "You'll never let me fall, right?" she had asked. Back then, I believed that promise with everything I had. Now, standing across from her years later, that memory felt painfully fragile. Rachel stepped toward the kitchen suddenly. "I'll get some water," she said. She left her purse on the dining chair, open, unattended, careless or distracted. I didn't move at first. Then slowly, almost without realizing it, my eyes drifted toward the opening of the bag. A folded statement peeked from inside. Printed columns, transaction dates, amounts. Too many digits to ignore. I stepped closer, careful, deliberate. The paper sat partially exposed, as if waiting to be seen. Rachel Whitaker Hale, her full name printed clearly at the top. Below it, rows of deposits, large ones, recent ones, multiple, not a single isolated payment. A pattern. My breath slowed. This wasn't speculation anymore. This was evidence. Footsteps approached behind me. I didn't move. Rachel returned to the room, holding a glass of water in both hands. She stopped the moment she saw where I stood. Her eyes dropped to the edge of the paper, still visible from her purse. For a split second, her face went completely still. Not shocked. Not confused. Recognizing, as if she had expected this moment all along. Neither of us spoke. The silence stretched until it felt heavy enough to break. Finally, she lowered the glass slowly onto the table. Her voice came out softer than I had ever heard it. "I didn't want you to find out this way." The words hung between us like a fragile thread ready to snap. And in that moment, standing there with proof in front of me and memories pressing hard against my chest, I realized something that hurt more than any financial loss ever could. This wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about my daughter. And whatever secret she had been carrying long before I ever saw that envelope slide across the dinner table. Rachel stood there, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, her eyes fixed somewhere just past my shoulder as if she were trying to gather the courage to say something she had rehearsed 100 times. "I didn't want you to find out this way," she repeated quietly. I let the silence sit between us. Sometimes silence revealed more truth than questions ever could. "What way?" I asked finally. She exhaled slowly, lowering herself into the chair across from me. The tension in her shoulders hadn't faded, if anything. It had settled deeper, heavier, like she had accepted that there was no turning back from whatever came next. "The money," she said carefully. "It wasn't what it looks like." Most people said that when it looked exactly like what it was. I didn't interrupt. I waited. Rachel kept her gaze lowered to the tabletop, tracing invisible lines with her finger as if following thoughts she hadn't decided whether to speak aloud. "Marcus told me it was an investment opportunity," she continued. "Something tied to company restructuring. He said it would help stabilize certain divisions before changes happened. Investment. Restructuring. Words dressed to sound responsible. Did you understand what those investments actually did?" I asked. She hesitated. That hesitation answered more than her words ever would. "He said it was temporary," she replied quietly. "That it would make the company stronger. The company, not Marcus, not money. The company." That choice of words stayed with me. Before I could respond, my phone vibrated against the table. Samuel. The name on the screen tightened something inside my chest. I answered immediately. "Yes." His voice came through sharp and fast, stripped of the calm professionalism he usually carried. They've triggered the audit, he said. The room around me seemed to narrow. What audit? I asked. Internal, he replied. Formal and fast-tracked. Rachel looked up sharply when she heard the word audit. Even she understood what that meant. Who initiated it? I asked. That's the problem, Samuel replied. It wasn't triggered by the board. It came through an anonymous compliance channel. Anonymous. That meant someone inside North River wanted something exposed, or wanted someone exposed. Samuel continued without waiting for another question. They're tracing financial movements across multiple divisions, he said. Marcus's department is one of the first under review. I felt Rachel's gaze settle on me. Watching, waiting, listening. Stay where you are, Samuel added. I'll call back as soon as I have more. The line went dead. Silence filled the room again. Heavier than before. Rachel spoke first. What does that mean? She asked quietly. It means someone started asking questions, I replied. Her fingers tightened around the glass she held. Too tight. Marcus didn't say anything about an audit, she murmured. I studied her expression carefully. Did he know it was coming? I asked. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. That pause stretched longer than comfort allowed. And in that hesitation, I saw something settle into place. Foreknowledge. Not certainty. But suspicion. He mentioned possible changes. She admitted slowly. Nothing specific. That wasn't reassurance. That was confirmation. My phone rang again before I could respond. Samuel. This time his voice carried something heavier beneath it. They froze several accounts tied to Marcus's division, he said. Frozen accounts. Not warnings. Not notices. Action. Temporarily, he added. But flagged. That word carried weight. Flagged meant watched. Watched meant documented. They're preparing full tracing reports. Samuel continued. If irregular movement shows patterns, it escalates to fraud investigation. Rachel inhaled sharply. Even from across the table, I could see the color drain slightly from her face. How fast? I asked. Samuel didn't hesitate. 48 hours, he replied. 48 hours. Not weeks. Not months. 48 hours to expose whatever had been building quietly beneath the surface. That's fast, I said. Too fast, Samuel replied. Someone pushed this through aggressively. Someone powerful. Someone prepared? The line went silent again. I lowered the phone slowly, my thoughts shifting from confusion to calculation. Rachel watched me carefully now, fear beginning to settle into her posture. What happens if they find something? She asked. Her voice sounded smaller than usual. If they find something, I said quietly, it won't stay inside the company. Legal involvement. Public exposure. Reputation collapse. She looked down at her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought Marcus knew what he was doing. That sentence carried something different. Not manipulation. Not calculation. Blind trust. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't Samuel. Victor. A single text message. Check your company stock logs. Short. Direct. Urgent. I moved to my study immediately, opening my laptop and logging into the secure shareholder portal, the one only a handful of people even knew existed. Rachel followed quietly behind me. Watching. The screen loaded slowly, each second stretching longer than it should have. Then the data appeared. Ownership percentages. Movement logs. Minor changes. Small shifts. Not dramatic enough to trigger alarms, but steady. Consistent. Someone had been repositioning shares. Carefully. Quietly. Piece by piece. Rachel leaned closer to the screen. What is that? She asked. Control, I replied. Her brow furrowed slightly. That doesn't look like much, she said. That's the point, I answered. Small moves avoided attention. Small moves built power. My phone rang again. Samuel, there's one more problem, he said. I felt the tension return instantly. "What now?" I asked. He hesitated, just long enough to signal something serious. "The audit team found an inactive executive override pathway," he said slowly. My pulse steadied. Not faster, just sharper. "And it traces back to your original founder credentials." The words landed like a stone dropped into deep water. Silent. Heavy. Unavoidable. I stared at the screen in front of me, watching the ownership numbers shift ever so slightly. And for the first time since that dinner, the full weight of the situation settled into place. This wasn't just about Marcus. This wasn't just about Rachel. This wasn't even about missing money. This was about authority. About access. About someone reaching into the foundation of everything I had built, using the very credentials that once gave life to the company. And now, with the audit already moving and the clock counting down toward exposure, I realized something that left no room for doubt. The next 48 hours would decide whether North River survived or collapsed under the weight of secrets that had been buried far too long. Samuel stayed on the line while I stared at the screen, the numbers shifting in small, deliberate increments that most people would have ignored. "The executive override wasn't triggered years ago," he said. "It was activated recently." Recently. That word settled into my chest like a slow weight pressing downward. I leaned closer to the laptop, scrolling through the authorization logs, watching timestamps appear one after another, each one tied to a sequence of approvals buried beneath layers of routine operations. Only someone with internal-level knowledge could access this pathway. Samuel continued. Internal-level knowledge. Marcus knew operations. He understood systems. But this required more than familiarity. It required history. It required patience. And patience meant planning. "Send me everything tied to Project Redline," I said quietly. There was a short pause. "You're about to see something you won't like," Samuel replied. A moment later, a notification appeared on my screen. Encrypted file received. Project Redline authorization, secondary access. Secondary. Not primary. Backup authority. I clicked the file open. Page after page of archived signatures scrolled into view, each tied to development phases that had been abandoned years ago. Most of the names belonged to executives long gone or divisions that no longer existed. Then I reached the final section. Signature block. One name printed clearly across the bottom. Rachel Whitaker. My breath caught without sound. Not Marcus. Not Victor. Rachel. The letters sat on the screen like they had always belonged there. Steady. Deliberate. Impossible to deny. I didn't speak. Didn't move. Just stared. Because sometimes shock didn't arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrived with stillness. Memory pushed forward before I could stop it. Rachel at 13. Standing in the hallway outside my office late at night. I had been packing for another business trip. One more flight tied to expansion meetings that felt urgent at the time. "You promised you'd stay this time," she had said. Her voice had cracked when she spoke. I remembered glancing at my watch instead of her face. Remembered telling her I'd make it up to her later. I never did. The memory faded as quickly as it arrived, leaving the present sharper than before. Samuel's voice came back through the phone. "There's more," he said. I forced myself to breathe again. "What kind of more?" I asked. "She didn't just sign once," he replied. "Her credentials were added years ago." Quietly. Under a mentorship access program. Mentorship. I remembered that initiative. Young professionals shadowing senior departments. Learning internal operations. I had approved it myself. She had extended access privileges. Samuel continued. More than most entry-level staff. That realization landed harder than the signature itself. Rachel hadn't stumbled into this. She had learned it. Studied it. Piece by piece. Footsteps sounded behind me. I turned. Rachel stood in the doorway. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Just presence. She hadn't knocked. Hadn't called out. She walked straight inside like she belonged in the middle of whatever storm had begun. "You saw it," she said quietly. "Not a question." A statement. Yes, I replied. Her gaze shifted to the laptop screen, then back to me. For the first time that day, I noticed something different in her expression. Not fear. Resolve. She stepped into the room and closed the door behind her, the soft click sounding louder than it should have. I was going to tell you, she said. Tell me what? I asked. She exhaled slowly. That I knew about the company long before Marcus did. The words landed carefully, deliberately, as if she had practiced them. He figured out pieces over time. She continued. But I was the one who connected everything. Connected everything. That phrase twisted something deep inside me. You started this, I said quietly. She didn't deny it. I started fixing it, she replied. Fixing. Another word that sounded harmless until you understood its cost. She walked closer, resting her hands lightly on the edge of the desk. I watched what happened after you left, she said. I watched leadership change. I watched people who didn't understand your system take control. Her voice trembled slightly now. Not from fear, but from emotion buried too long. You think I abandoned the company? I said. I think you abandoned more than that, she replied. Silence stretched between us. She swallowed hard before continuing. You left people behind, she said. Families who depended on that company? People who trusted you. The words stung because part of me recognized truth hidden inside them. I thought if I stabilized control, she continued, if I secured ownership pathways, then nothing like that would ever happen again. Ownership pathways. Control. Authority. She hadn't been acting blindly. She had been acting strategically. Carefully. For years. And Marcus? I asked. He executes, she replied. I design. That sentence cut deeper than anything else she had said, because it revealed the full shape of what had been happening beneath the surface. Marcus wasn't the architect. Rachel was. She straightened slightly, her voice lowering as she spoke again. There's one more stage, she said. I didn't respond. Didn't interrupt. Just waited. The final document is ready, she continued. Board-level submission. My pulse slowed. Not from calm, but from focus. If approved, she added. Ownership structure shifts permanently. How long? I asked. Her answer came without hesitation. Hours. Not days. Not weeks. Hours? The room felt smaller with each passing second. Rachel looked at me then, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something that looked dangerously close to exhaustion. Did you ever think about what your silence did to us? She asked. The question hit harder than the documents, harder than the financial data, harder than anything tied to corporate control. Because that question wasn't about money. It was about absence, about distance, about years spent choosing work over presence. She reached into her bag and pulled out a sealed document, placing it gently on the desk between us. The movement mirrored Marcus's gesture from that dinner night. But now the weight felt different. Now the stakes were clear. This goes to the board tonight, she said quietly. I stared at the document without touching it. Unless you stop me. And in that moment, standing across from my daughter with the future of everything I had built sitting between us, I realized the truth I had avoided for years. This war hadn't started with Marcus. It hadn't started with missing files. It had started long before that. With choices. With absence. With silence that had grown into something neither of us fully understood until now. Samuel stayed on the line while I stared at the screen. The numbers shifting in small, deliberate increments that most people would have ignored. The executive override wasn't triggered years ago, he said. It was activated recently. Recently. That word settled into my chest like a slow weight pressing downward. I leaned closer to the laptop, scrolling through the authorization logs, watching timestamps appear one after another, each one tied to a sequence of approvals buried beneath layers of routine operations. Only someone with internal-level knowledge could access this pathway. Samuel continued. Internal-level knowledge. Marcus knew operations. He understood systems. But this This required more than familiarity. It required history. It required patience. And patience meant planning. "Send me everything tied to Project Redline," I said quietly. There was a short pause. "You're about to see something you won't like," Samuel replied. A moment later, a notification appeared on my screen. Encrypted file received. Project Redline authorization, secondary access. Secondary, not primary. Backup authority. I clicked the file open. Page after page of archived signatures scrolled into view, each tied to development phases that had been abandoned years ago. Most of the names belonged to executives long gone or divisions that no longer existed. Then I reached the final section. Signature block. One name printed clearly across the bottom. Rachel Whitaker. My breath caught without sound. Not Marcus. Not Victor. Rachel. The letters sat on the screen like they had always belonged there. Steady. Deliberate. Impossible to deny. I didn't speak. Didn't move. Just stared. Because sometimes shock didn't arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrived with stillness. Memory pushed forward before I could stop it. Rachel at 13. Standing in the hallway outside my office late at night. I had been packing for another business trip. One more flight tied to expansion meetings that felt urgent at the time. "You promised you'd stay this time," she had said. Her voice had cracked when she spoke. I remembered glancing at my watch instead of her face. Remembered telling her I'd make it up to her later. I never did. The memory faded as quickly as it arrived, leaving the present sharper than before. Samuel's voice came back through the phone. "There's more," he said. I forced myself to breathe again. "What kind of more?" I asked. "She didn't just sign once," he replied. "Her credentials were added years ago." Quietly. Under a mentorship access program. Mentorship. I remembered that initiative. Young professionals shadowing senior departments. Learning internal operations. I had approved it myself. She had extended access privileges. Samuel continued. More than most entry-level staff. That realization landed harder than the signature itself. Rachel hadn't stumbled into this. She had learned it. Studied it. Piece by piece. Footsteps sounded behind me. I turned. Rachel stood in the doorway. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Just presence. She hadn't knocked. Hadn't called out. She walked straight inside like she belonged in the middle of whatever storm had begun. "You saw it," she said quietly. Not a question. A statement. "Yes," I replied. Her gaze shifted to the laptop screen, then back to me. For the first time that day, I noticed something different in her expression. Not fear. "Resolve." She stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. The soft click sounding louder than it should have. "I was going to tell you," she said. "Tell me what?" I asked. She exhaled slowly. "That I knew about the company long before Marcus did." The words landed carefully, deliberately, as if she had practiced them. "He figured out pieces over time," she continued. "But I was the one who connected everything." Connected everything. That phrase twisted something deep inside me. "You started this," I said quietly. She didn't deny it. "I started fixing it," she replied. Fixing. Another word that sounded harmless until you understood its cost. She walked closer, resting her hands lightly on the edge of the desk. "I watched what happened after you left," she said. "I watched leadership change. I watched people who didn't understand your system take control." Her voice trembled slightly now. Not from fear, but from emotion buried too long. "You think I abandoned the company?" I said. "I think you abandoned more than that," she replied. Silence stretched between us. She swallowed hard before continuing. "You left people behind," she said. "Families who depended on that company. People who trusted you." The words stung because part of me recognized truth hidden inside them. "I thought if I stabilized control," she continued, "if I secured ownership pathways, then nothing like that would ever happen again." Ownership pathways. Control. Authority. She hadn't been acting blindly. She had been acting strategically. carefully. For years. And Marcus? I asked. He executes, she replied. I design. That sentence cut deeper than anything else she had said, because it revealed the full shape of what had been happening beneath the surface. Marcus wasn't the architect. Rachel was. She straightened slightly, her voice lowering as she spoke again. There's one more stage, she said. I didn't respond. Didn't interrupt. Just waited. The final document is ready, she continued. Board-level submission. My pulse slowed. Not from calm, but from focus. If approved, she added. Ownership structure shifts permanently. How long? I asked. Her answer came without hesitation. Hours. Not days. Not weeks. Hours. The room felt smaller with each passing second. Rachel looked at me then, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something that looked dangerously close to exhaustion. Did you ever think about what your silence did to us? She asked. The question hit harder than the documents, harder than the financial data, harder than anything tied to corporate control. Because that question wasn't about money. It was about absence, about distance, about years spent choosing work over presence. She reached into her bag and pulled out a sealed document, placing it gently on the desk between us. The movement mirrored Marcus's gesture from that dinner night. But now the weight felt different. Now the stakes were clear. This goes to the board tonight, she said quietly. I stared at the document without touching it, unless you stop me. And in that moment, standing across from my daughter with the future of everything I had built sitting between us, I realized the truth I had avoided for years. This war hadn't started with Marcus. It hadn't started with missing files. It had started long before that. With choices. With absence. With silence that had grown into something neither of us fully understood until now.